Welcome back. I hope that you've had a really good weekend. We are really close to the finish line at this point. We have 2 more weeks left of the term. And in these 2 weeks, we just have today for more of a lecture and discussion regarding preparing for persuasive speeches, speaking for social change, some of the things to expect for persuasive speeches. And then the last 5 classes are all going to be persuasive speeches. So we are getting close. We don't have a meeting time for the final exam. We just have the persuasive speeches this week and next week. So I'll be sharing the persuasive speech schedule, also the rubric and the expectations for this assignment. If you were not here last Friday, I encourage you to watch the recording so that you can be caught up on material regarding the genre of persuasive speaking and some of the expectations of the speech. So to get us started, last class, we talked about informative speeches, some of the general feedback and comments on those. All of the informative speeches have grades and feedback available on Canvas for you to access and help you to prepare. We also talked last class about persuasive speaking, some of the general expectations, structure, how we use arguments in persuasive speaking to make a larger point. For today, we'll be building off of those ideas. But just to get you on the same page, for informative speaking, continue to work on your incorporation verbally of sources, right? Whenever you are drawing from a source, you might say, The Economist in March 2019 wrote that XYZ. So make sure you are clarifying to the audience where that's coming from, including in text and works cited. If you're needing help with that, I encourage you to reach out to me or to the Writing Center to make sure that you have that in the outline. These are going to be speeches given face-to-face for persuasive. So you're welcome to continue to work on developing those online skills, but this speech will be given in class. So just as a reminder for this particular assignment, right, I'm asking you to pick a topic where your focus is on changing attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, right? The idea here of persuasive speaking is that you're taking a leap for the audience and asking them to get to a different point where they might have started, right? So it's a Goldilocks situation, as I mentioned last week. I encourage you to find a topic that requires most students in the class to have to move from their established point of view or behavior. So something like brushing your teeth, right? That should be a good thing that everybody's doing, hopefully, right? On the other extreme, things that are like deep-seated values, beliefs such as political, spiritual, cultural, religious, those types of views are not things that are likely going to change in the course of 6 to 8 minutes, right? They're things that we oftentimes hold very close to us. So it's difficult for us to be able to persuade audiences about topics that are that heated or controversial. You're welcome to pick them. And again, it's not my job to censor you, but I encourage you to find something in the middle that requires people to adopt some type of change in their thinking or attitude, but not so much that it's too much to bite off over the course of a speech. So I gave the example last week of encouraging people to reuse bags at stores rather than using plastic bags. That'd be an example of a speech that requires people to do something and put some effort in, but makes a case for why that would be an important thing to do. I also wanted to share, so I was able to represent the scheduling restrictions that you all submitted in the beginning of the term, as well as submitted last week, as you had an update on that. So for Wednesday, we'll have Mary, Noah, Ella, Alex, and Michaela. On Friday, we'll have Alofa, Natanya, Lizzie, Audrey, and Kenzie. Monday, March 13th, we will have Natalie, Olivia, Austin, Kelly, and Jessica. March 15th, we'll have Chad, CJ, Luli, Cade, and Chris. And then March 17th is Tucker, Annika, Skylar, Devin, and Ferris. So again, I tried to support folks who were speaking earlier last time to speak later the next time, and vice versa. So that's the persuasive speaking schedule. If there is an issue or conflict that you anticipate with your day, please let me know. Send me an email as soon as possible so that I can reschedule you. Otherwise, you should prepare for that day. Since this is happening in class, I will be asking again that you print out your outline ahead of time so that I can review it as you're giving the speech. So make sure that you've printed that, and as well as a copy for yourself so that you can use that as you're working through the speech. So like before, if you are not speaking, we'll have you do a peer review for days that you're not scheduled, and we'll have the chance to talk about and debrief these speeches together. I'm always happy to be available in office hours for you. Again, I have office hours right after class for 2 hours. So you're welcome to stop by. You're welcome to email me a draft or outline or anything else that you would like for me to provide feedback on, or even practice giving the speech to me. And I'm happy to look that over and take a look at the assignment. Okay, so we also spent some time last class talking about some of the different parts of a model of argument, right? The idea here is that as you're giving a persuasive speech, one of the things that I'll be grading and looking at is your ability to construct an argument that advocates for the particular points that you're trying to make, right? So I went ahead and have the rubric available for you as you're preparing for this assignment. Just as a reminder, there is no requirement to include visual aids on this assignment. The visual aids are things that you can include if you would like. For example, you can, but you're not required to include slides. If you are including slides, I encourage you to send those to me in advance so that I can pull them up for you. Alternatively, you could bring in a prop. You could bring in, if you really wanted to be fancy, you could bring in something like an easel display with the boards like we saw, but certainly don't need to do that and don't need to spend the time and money to do that. So it's your choice, but if you do find that there are visual aids that might enhance the speech or enhance the delivery, you're welcome to include those to supplement your points, right? So kind of similar to previous outlines, I'm looking at, if you've turned that in, 3 outside sources with works cited and in-text citations, making sure that you're choosing a persuasive speech prompt, right? The use of supporting evidence and details is really important here, drawing from examples, statistics, other forms of evidence to support your main points. I encourage you to think about drawing from credible sources, things such as academic sources, studies, rather than citing from like Wikipedia or citing from a blog, right, where anybody can post that content. Wikipedia is a good starting point, but not a good ending point for finding that supporting material. And then organization and delivery, right, building off of those things that we've been working on before. Think about this as your chance to share and show off some of the things that you've learned over the course of this term, areas where you feel like you have grown and developed in those speaking skills. So you're welcome to work on that as you're preparing for this assignment. When it comes to developing arguments and points in your speech, right? You don't necessarily have to follow this linear structure and like provide each of those points. Now I'm going to provide my warrant. Now I'm going to provide my backing. You don't need to do that, but I do encourage you to think about how you're able to create structure and support for arguments that you attempt to make in your speech. For example, if I was trying to give you a persuasive speech about why you should take an economics class and learn fundamentals in economics, right? I might say, as a claim of policy, you should, right, take the action of taking a course in economics here at EOU, right? That'd be a claim of policy because it's actor in action. Claim of value would be economics is better than biology, right? Or a claim of fact would be economics is a good skill to learn. So evidence or ground is your main support, right? You might provide an explanation about how there was a study done that shows the benefits of learning economics. Provide a warrant, right? That's the explanation about why that study supports your claim. And then there are other parts here that might be relevant, such as most of the time, if you can fit it in your schedule, you should take this. And then arguments indicating the scope of when your claim is not correct. So what I'm going to be doing is looking at some examples here of effective persuasive speaking, and in particular, talking about the idea of public speaking for social change, right? So the idea here is that you'll be put into situations professionally and personally where you're going to be giving speeches and presentations to groups, but you also might find yourself in situations where you're speaking on issues that you're passionate about and you care about, or you want to get involved into issues that are important. And so I think it's a good idea for us to understand how public speaking is informed and helps us to better understand and relate to a lot of significant issues related to social change as well. So we'll get going on that and then use that to understand a little bit better some of the fundamentals of good persuasive speaking. Before we get started on that, any questions about the persuasive speech schedule, anything else? Yeah, Chris?
I was wondering with the slides, will we have control of the slides or will we ask you to change the slides?
So if you provide the slides in advance and give me everything I need to pull them up, you're welcome to use and go through them yourself.
Is there a fob or something?
So I don't have a fob or clicker here. So I would encourage if you have anything that you would like to use outside of the keyboard and bringing the keyboard around, you would likely be able to hook it up via USB. But I encourage you, you might come into the class when nobody's teaching here and see if you're able to use it in that way.
Yeah.
Good question. Any other questions? Yeah.
One more. You were talking about last class, we talked about stuff. The one thing I remember about last class is we stayed after to listen to a few other people's speeches. Did I miss the class?
Last Friday?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about.
So last Friday, we had a class discussing persuasive speaking. So we talked a little bit about the persuasive speaking genre. We talked a little bit about different types of persuasive speeches. So the slides and recording are up for that day, so you can access that.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So I think when we look at skills in public speaking, right, there are a lot of different ways that we can apply and use those skills in meaningful ways. Public speaking for social change, right? If we think about the idea of public speaking, it's about this idea of building relationships between ourselves and the audience with which we are speaking, right? It's forming meaningful connections, and that audience is live, they're there with us in the moment. And social change is the idea of transforming culture, transforming our thoughts, our beliefs, our ideas. We think about a lot of major advocates with regard to social change. We think about folks such as Cesar Chavez or MLK, right? We think about people that are transformative in terms of how we're thinking about and engaging in a variety of topics or issues, right? So to understand social change, I think it's a good idea for us to examine social movements and some of the ways in which communication about those has been developed effectively. By the way, I teach a course at EOU called Communication for Social Change that explores some of those topics in more detail. So if that's something you find interesting, know that that's an option. It's a 300 level course that fulfills DPD. So which of the following is true about social movements? So I like to do a little bit of a poll early on to see people's understanding of some of these ideas. So how many people say A involves groups of people who speak out for social or political change? B, new media, including social media. C, pushing for views that are not necessarily accepted by mainstream. Or D, all of the above. So a lot of people seem unsure, and that's okay, right? So correct answer here is all of the above, right? We think about the idea of a social movement. A social movement is how we use public speaking and communication to advocate across a variety of different issues, right? It's people who are using a variety of forms of communication. We can think about the ways in which the Arab Spring, which began in the early 2010s, uniquely was situating Twitter and other forms of social media to get out the word, right? The Arab Spring started with a man who set himself on fire, right, to protest the current political order and leadership. And this had a massive spillover effect. And so if you were familiar with some of the violence and unrest in countries such as Syria, if you're familiar with significant regime change, in a variety of these countries, that has been a result of this movement and some of the impacts that it had, right? So social movement is about how we're using communication and public speaking as a way to advocate across these different types of topics. So when it comes to utilizing these in public speaking, right? It's a public speaking course. There are generally two different strategies that are used. There's advocacy and activism, right? And in understanding the difference between those two, I think it's important for us to understand the difference in the audience and the strategy that might be utilized here. We can think about advocacy as working within a system or working within an organization. We think about activism as working outside of a system as a means of changing or adjusting what's going on within that circle. If we look at advocacy, right? Advocacy is how we are using public speaking skills and how we're using persuasion as a way to convince other people to solve or address an issue. So in other words, the idea behind advocacy is that you are focused on decision makers. You're focused on people who will ultimately have an impact on something. A good example of this is if you're involved in a club or activity on campus, right? And perhaps you're seeking funding for your club to travel, to do events. And so you reach out to ASCOU and they hold a meeting in which you share, make your pitch, and make your case for why your club should receive funding and added support, right? You are reaching out to the relevant decision makers who are able to address this issue. How many folks are familiar or have heard about Judy Heumann? Cool. Good example here of disability history just not being taught, right? It's something that I think a lot of us have not had the same access to and understanding of. My expertise, my area of study is in disability rights, disability communication, how folks with disabilities advocate and advance a variety of different issues, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, was not passed and ratified until 1990, which has provided reasonable accommodation, right? So if you have ever had to receive accommodations for a course, right, or there's been a medical exemption that you've had, that has been because of the ADA, which is something that has been able to provide accommodations for a lot of people and moves us away from a history of institutionalization. So Judy Heumann actually passed away just a few days ago at 75. And she was one of the most prominent advocates for disability rights in the United States. In fact, she was known for a variety of different strategies. So one of the things that she did with other advocates was to essentially block some of the busiest intersections in New York City from traffic, and gained a lot of attention for doing that. It was also part of a sit-in at the California State Capitol in collaboration with Black Panthers, who provided them with food. They were able to get Section 504 of the Civil Rights Act through, which was able to provide some disability protections, right? And then more recently was involved in advocating for international disability rights. So prominent advocate on a lot of those issues. Yeah.
What year did you see him with Black Panthers?
Kind of have to look back on that one. I'm not positive. No, it was quite a ways back because Section 504 was passed in the 80s. Yeah. So I wanted to share a snippet from an address that she gave to Congress that was advocating for passage of the ADA. And I think this is a good example here of some of the ways in which effective, persuasive communication is able to use this strategy overall.
Over the years, experience has taught us that we must be constantly aware of people's attempts to discriminate against us. We must be prepared at every moment to fight this discrimination. The average American is not, nor should they have to be prepared to fight every day of their life for basic civil rights. All too many instances of discrimination can become undefended because of lack of protection under the law. In the past, disability has been cause for shame. This forced acceptance of second-class citizenship has stripped us as disabled people of pride and dignity. This is not the way we as Americans should have to live our lives. When I was 5, my mother proudly pushed my wheelchair to our local public school, where I was promptly refused admission because the principal ruled that I was, quote, a fire hazard, end quote. I was forced to go on home instruction, receiving 1 hour of education twice a week for 3.5 years. Was this the America of my parents' dreams? My entrance into mainstream society was blocked by discrimination and segregation. Segregation was not only on an institutional level, but also acted as an obstruction to social integration. As a teenager, I could not travel with my parents on a bus because it was not accessible. At my graduation from high school, the principal attempted to present me with an exceptional award in a ceremony on stage, simply because I was in a wheelchair. When I was 19, the house mother of my college dormitory refused me admission into the dorm because I was in a wheelchair and needed assistance. When I was 21 years old, I was not in elementary school teaching credentials because of, quote, paralysis of both lower extremities, the sequelae of poliomyelitis, end quote. At this time, I didn't know what sequelae meant. I went to the dictionary and looked it up and found out that it was because of it. So, usually depends on the ability of discriminated. Again, at the age of 5, I was 36 months out here in the U.S. Senate because I was blind without an attendant. In 1981, an attempt was made to forcibly remove me and another disabled friend from an auction house because we were so disgusting to look at. End quote. In 1983, a manager at a movie theater attempted to keep my disabled friend and myself out of his theater because we could not transfer out of our wheelchairs. These are only a few examples of discrimination I have faced in my 4-year life. I successfully fought all of the independent aggressive confrontation or litigation, but this is not bars for life. Many disabled persons experience discrimination of the same magnitude, but not every one of us possesses the intestinal fortitude and has the support of family and friends required to face up to these daily societal barriers. Sadly, these are not isolated examples true only in the past tense. This is an ongoing social phenomenon which haunts our lives at every minute. I have been told throughout my life the understanding of these people's actions. Quote, they don't know any better, end quote. Not us nor any one of the 42 million other people with disabilities can wait for the 200 million non-disabled Americans to become educated to fact that this does not negate our entitlements to the same constitutional rights as this other legislation has made previously sanctioned discrimination illegal. So too will the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1988 outlaw protectivist, paternalistic, ignorant discrimination against all persons with disabilities.
So of 1988, so it was not passed until 1990. So I think this does a good job here of showing us examples of both persuasive communication, use of structured argument, and use of advocacy, right? First of all, right, this is a specific policy claim that Human is ultimately making, right? Passage of the 1988 ADA and citing the ways in which it would address forms of discrimination and experiences that other folks with disabilities have encountered, right? She uses a lot of personal examples of testimony talking about being told that she shouldn't be in a space because she was disgusting to look at, right? Using those examples of personal experiences is good, right? But I think the thing that helps this to be effective is the ways that those personal experiences are applied to make a broader argument about how a variety of folks with disabilities have experienced discrimination, have not been able to receive accommodation and support, right? And is putting that together with some broader statistics about number of folks with disabilities, urging specific concrete action to address that issue, right? And giving this speech to Congress is giving it to members of Congress, senators, representatives, who would be ultimately voting on and making decisions on whether to pass that legislation. So directly targeting the relevant decision makers to get them to do it. So you can think about a lot of other examples of this. Things such as town hall events in which we have a member of Congress or leader, right? EOU even has some like public events. There's been an ongoing search, right, for EOU's new president for the next year that has also invited discussion surrounding that topic. So speaking to a community or group who is able to make decisions about an issue is generally what we would consider to be advocacy-oriented public speaking, right? This is the idea of encouraging the use of civic engagement. In other words, participating in available resources to the public. One thing EOUist is encouraging people about voting, right? Encouraging people to vote in a specific way, vote on a specific topic, whether it's sending in, right, your state ballot, or whether it's voting in something like an ASUU election, right? So encouraging people to get involved with resources that are available for them to engage. And advocates ask decision makers to take specific actions, right, such as voting for a bill or donating to a cause. So it's always clear in those speeches what it is that the relevant decision makers are expected to do, right? You could give a rousing, excellent, persuasive speech, but what am I supposed to do with it? What is the goal here? What are you trying to get me to do? So making it as concrete as possible is good. And it's not always about policy, right? Sometimes it's about getting people to adopt a belief system or view, or to accept something as factual evidence. And those can be other ways of using advocacy, right? Perhaps it's a public speaker who is educating us about the impacts of drunk and impaired driving and helping us to factually understand those issues in greater capacity. And advocacy is about consciousness raising, right? It's about making other people aware that a problem exists and helping us to understand some of the ways to solve that issue, right? One of the things to think about with regard to disability history specifically is that folks with disabilities historically have been institutionalized, right? They've been taken out of public participation and involvement. That's been something that Human was speaking to. So there were a lot of members of Congress and a lot of folks that just did not know some of the ways in which facilities, spaces were designed and structured in that way. There was just not awareness about some of those issues, and simply bringing those concerns to one's attention are ways of helping to make a persuasive argument, right? So one thing you could think about for your persuasive speech is what is information that the audience needs to know that simply isn't widely acceptable or understood? So bringing in that information to bolster your main points is a way that you can utilize this effectively. So Judy, right, talking about how she must act without delay to end this, using consciousness raising, talking about how when she was 5, her mother pushed her wheelchair to a public school where she was denied admission, and using some of those elements of advocacy-oriented speaking. How many folks are familiar with Malala? Have heard about her? Yeah, so several of you, right? So she is famous for being an advocate, an activist on behalf of young women and girls, particularly encouraging education. If you're not familiar, right, she survived a nearly fatal bullet wound to the head, right? And from that, she was able to gain a national and international platform to advocate on behalf of women's rights, and particularly to focus on education, right? So if advocacy is working within a circle, right, it's working within a system or organization in order to achieve social and political and cultural change, the use of activism is about working outside of those systems, right? It's about creating support and directing pressure toward decision makers. Rather than saying you should do X, Y, Z, it's providing an external push that creates the circumstances necessary for folks to act, right? If we think about a lot of the history of civil rights, a lot of civil rights was not necessarily about speaking on behalf of Congress. It was about doing things such as Selma, right, as an example of getting and creating pressure, creating news attention, and other forms of interest in the topic. So what I'm going to be showing here is an example of the ways in which Malala incorporates elements of activism. So with activist-oriented public speaking, right, it's about this idea of social agitation, right, using things such as civil disobedience. We might be familiar with Rosa Parks, right, refusing to sit in the back, violating a culture's norms. So going against what are the rules or expectations of the time as a way of making a point. Activism is in many ways strategic, right? There's decades of history of organization, of leadership that's designed to use activism well. I've in other courses talked a little bit about some of the ways that activists understand the relationship between activism and media, particularly more senior activists. For example, there was a nonviolent protest that was an occupation of a bridge in Memphis for Black Lives Matter, right? And some of the more senior activists were like putting garbage cans back up because some of the younger activists were knocking them down intentionally, right? Because they didn't want the media attention to be dedicated to destruction of property and recognize that distracted from the message, right? So some of those strategies and some of those differences that people make in that type of advocacy are important considerations here, right? So in this way, activism is much more focused on pressure, right? It's about creating the conditions that force relevant decision makers to act rather than trying to make a reasoned case for them. In some situations, right, no matter how persuasive of an argument you present, somebody's not going to have their opinion change. So it's about perhaps raising pressure by convincing constituents and voters to adopt a change and to encourage relevant leaders to make that change for themselves. So I wanted to share a little bit from Malala and talking about her own experiences advocating and engaging in activist change.
Oregon State residents, if you have a millimeter, like that on the side of your house, we are truly honored to have our next guest here in studio. Malala Yousafzai has been an outspoken advocate in the fight for every girl's right to an education. It was nearly 10 years ago, Malala, who was just 15 years old at the time, was shot by a member of the Taliban on the way home from school.
In the years since, the young activist has continued advocacy work through the nonprofit she co-founded with her dad. Peace Prize in 2014, and it also made her the youngest Nobel laureate in the history. And she is with us this morning. Malala, so honored to have you.
Thank you. Someone has to break that record.
Someone probably will never forget that, but you're here because you received the Elevate Prize Catalyst Award from the Clinton Global Initiative on yesterday. The Clintons have won it, Trevor Noah has won it, and with the award comes also over $250,000 for the Malala Fund, unrestricted funding. What is a gift like that? What does it mean for the fund? How do you plan to use those funds?
I'm so honored to receive the award, and this money is going to help us to find alternative learning opportunities for Afghan children right now. Girls' education is banned in Afghanistan at the secondary level, and we want children to have alternative means of learning in this time as we push for their right to have access to education in a classroom as well. And we will be supporting Afghan activists who are fighting for the right of all Afghans to be in school.
When you talk about what some of the barriers are for these girls trying to get an education, and for folks at home who are watching, how can they help this fight?
It's really hard to convey this message to people, but there is a global emergency in education. There are so many factors that are pushing so many children out of school, including climate change, wars, and other crises. Look at what's happening in Afghanistan and Ukraine. Look at how the floods have impacted so many schools in Pakistan right now. So how tens and thousands of schools have been washed away in these floods. So because of all these catastrophes that we hear about, yes, children are directly impacted, girls are impacted, and they're often disproportionately impacted. So we need to create this urgency that we prioritize the education of our children. And if our leaders are serious about the future of children, then they have to be serious about education.
So Malala's emphasis here on creating awareness, creating urgency with issues regarding education, particularly for young women and girls who oftentimes do not have that access in countries like Pakistan, right, is an important element of her speech. So we can think about this and the idea of social agitation, of raising up our voices to get out of the situation and standing up to the right to go to school, right? A lot of her activism has been centered about changing the status quo of how education is provided. Using her story and platform as a part of push for this education is a way to utilize that in a strategic way. We can think about a lot of other examples here of how people who have been personally impacted or related to an experience are using that experience as a part of making a persuasive argument, right? And there's an emphasis here on pressure, on convincing members of the government to offer school and to offer this opportunity, right? Using things such as funding, such as nonprofit funding, grant funding, and so on. As a part of this advocacy is about creating the situations for pressure and change. So when it comes to some of the ways in which people use persuasion to advocate on behalf of a variety of different issues, it's important to recognize that there's oftentimes a combination of different strategies, right? That public speaking for social change is not just about using either activism or using advocacy and just adhering to that, but rather recognizing the combination of strategies that can use effective communication. So for instance, Human, as mentioned, helped to occupy some major New York City streets to pressure Congress in support of disability advocacy and services. Right, the use of civil disobedience and nonviolent protest is oftentimes done in a very strategic way that is meant to gain attention, traction, and support with regard to an issue that is just falling under the radar otherwise. We can also think about how while Malala's focus has been much more activism-centric about changing the status quo, right, that she's also done more advocacy-oriented speeches. For instance, speaking in the United Nations and trying to receive support for an international fund for free education. So showing us how she can also give a speech focused on relevant decision makers and helping us to understand how purpose and audience can shape the different types of appeals that we make, the way that we utilize supporting evidence, and so on. So one thing to think about for your speech is whether or not the speech fits with more of an activist or advocacy-oriented frame. Right? You can think about advocacy as being very reform-oriented. How do we reform or change or adjust our way of thinking about the resources that we have available? So you have a set of courses that you get to pick for the term, right? Maybe there's a reason that you should take a particular course, such as taking economics to learn about economics, right? Or taking a more activist bent and saying, you should be a part of this extracurricular activity that is addressing, dealing with a variety of endangered species. So you might be pushing for something that's a little bit outside of that frame. So when you think about how you speak for social change, there's a variety of factors to consider here, right? One of them is thinking about your audience. We know that there's been a lot of intense social, political, and cultural polarization, right? We know that oftentimes folks are coming from very deep-seated and perspectives of conviction, right? So it can be very difficult to recognize what the audience is, right? So there's what's known as a general audience who you're speaking to more broadly, and a rhetorical audience who is the set of people that are uniquely mobilized toward change. We think about a lot of action by Congress over the last several years. It's not necessarily focused on changing the opinion of an opposing party who might be very unlikely to support something. It's typically about people who are in the middle, right? A lot of swing votes. So if you follow like the US Senate, right, a lot of senators such as Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are people who are very much closest to the middle in terms of needing to be persuaded one way or the other on things. So both parties utilize that, right? So figuring out who the audience is that you're actively trying to persuade and convince about a topic is really important. Because rather than just giving a speech that's rallying or speaking to the choir, right, your goal is to convince people to adopt some type of change. Speaking from the heart matters, right? So effective persuasive speaking is persuasive speaking that is utilizing personal examples and your experience to present material in a relatable way. So human talking about her own experiences, experiencing discrimination on the basis of disability, Malala talking about her story and the ways in which she has survived and advocated are ways that utilizing personal examples can be helpful. Speaking more generally, utilizing platforms, including social media platforms, I think is a good way to get involved if you find yourself as a part of an issue that you care about, right? I think that our ability to change and adjust to new forms of social media is incredibly important, right? There's an entirely new generation that is using a variety of new outlets like TikTok. Getting something out through Facebook is not necessarily going to fly the same way anymore. So being able to adjust and adapt to change in that way is important. It's important for us to be sensitive with regard to who we're speaking for and who we're speaking with, right? So there are a lot of communities with which there is internal disagreement, and not everybody necessarily takes on the same terminology or wants the exact same things, right? So for instance, in a lot of disability-related spaces, there is significant pushback and disagreement. So for instance, in the use of language, right? There are some folks who believe very strongly in the usage of person-first language, a person with disabilities, right? And feel very strongly about that. And there are other folks who feel strongly about identity-first language, calling themselves a disabled person, which is particularly common in more neurodivergent circles, right? So one challenge is if you universalize one way of referring to disability, then there might be people within the community who disagree or are frustrated with that language choice. So engaging with the community or group that you're speaking for is important, and recognizing the boundaries of doing that is an important thing to realize as well. And it's also important for us to, again, engage in preparation and practice, helping us to better understand and engage professionally on whatever cause or issue we find ourselves interested and involved in, right? So strategies of social change can be really effective. And I think thinking about those a little bit more is helping us as we're thinking about some of the supporting material and forms of engagement that you can use as you're giving your persuasive speech. So with some of that in mind, I have an attendance prompt that I'll ask you to take some time to work on that will count as your attendance for the day. So I'd like you to take some time on your own to write or type here. And I'd like you to take a few minutes to address these questions. First of all, what's one topic that you're interested in for your persuasive speech? So you might have taken some of the ideas that you had last week and had the chance to expand on them, or maybe you're really thinking about the persuasive speech for the first time. Either way, take some time to think about a topic that you're interested in and wanting to explore a bit more. Second of all, I want you to think about who you're trying to convince, right? What are you trying to convince your audience to do? By the end of the speech, what is the expectation in an ideal world that your audience will accomplish? Are they donating? Are they voting? Are they, bringing in a reusable bag? Like, what is it that you want them to think, to believe, to act? Because the better you can tangibly identify that, the clearer the purpose is going to be for your speech. And given the things that we've discussed, would you put this more in the realm of activist or advocacy, right? Not all speeches that are persuasive are necessarily about social or cultural issues, but you can think about how the more activist strategies working outside versus advocacy working inside might be utilized in this speech as well. So really, as you're thinking about and finalizing and really starting to work about your persuasive speech topic, this is really an opportunity for you to think about the issues and topics that you care about, that you're passionate about, that you're interested in speaking to, and having that opportunity to engage in that platform, right? It's a great way to test out what it means to advocate and to speak about an issue you're interested in, whatever that might be. So I encourage you to take on that opportunity. We have the chance to talk a little bit about speaking for social change today, and some of these elements and examples of effective persuasive speaking, and how they utilize structured arguments to make their points. On Wednesday, we will hear our first set of persuasive speeches, so I look forward to that. Again, double check the schedule. Let me know if you anticipate any conflicts. Please email or pass forward your attendance prompt for the day. Have a great rest of your morning, and I'll see you again on Wednesday.